Mercutio is one of the most important characters in the play. He didn't exist in the source poem that Shakespeare based his play on, so we can see that Shakespeare's invested himself into the character, whereas so many of the other characters are just given to him. So we're diving in to the Queen Mab speech, and this is the end of the Queen Mab speech. Now what we have to understand is that that speech develops almost like a piece of music into a crescendo as Mercutio gets angrier and angrier about what Queen Mab does to the courtier, the soldier, the lawyer. Everybody is increasingly corrupt. But the most corrupt thing that Queen Mab does is trains maids to lie on their backs. On the one hand, this means taking virgins and showing them how to have sex. But in the next line, teaches them first to bear. To bear meant to suffer, and it also meant to give birth. Now, why is he so upset about this? Because in Elizabethan times, every time you gave birth to a baby, the idea was that you were dicing with death. Mothers died in childbirth, probably 1 in every 25 births. And, in a typical lifetime, it wasn't unusual for a woman to have between 6 and 10 children. Therefore, there was a really high chance of women dying. There's almost a feminist perspective here, where Mercutio is equating sexual freedom with the danger of death. So it might seem as though he's trying to protect women. Or we can read it another way. Mercutio has a disgust about heterosexual sex, and so he's deeply critical of Queen Mab, but also of the women who enjoy this sex that risks their lives. When the Queen Mab speech started, of course, it's a kind of childhood fantasy showing off Mercutio's amazing imagination and quick wits. Mercutio's name comes from Mercury, the quickest of metals and also the quickest of the gods. But it's easy to be misled here and see Mercutio as a kind of fun-loving wit and miss the deeper darkness of his worldview. And it's that darkness which is going to get you those top grades. Shakespeare also uses Mercutio to offer us an alternative view of Romeo. So his view is that Romeo's love is fake, it's just a pose. This is why he mocks the rhyming of love and dove. It's the most predictable, unimaginative rhyme. And in the play itself, Romeo does use the image of a dove when he talks about Juliet. And Juliet uses these words, love and dove, together when she's talking about Romeo. So Shakespeare uses Mercutio to say, actually, this love is perhaps childish, it's not real, and what does underpin their love is actually sexual desire. But here, when he's making fun of Romeo to Benvolio, he also puts himself in the place of the lover. He imagines himself being satisfied by Romeo creating a poem for him, however bad that poem is with its rhymes of love and dove. And as we go through the play, we'll see Mercutio has a really strong desire for Romeo's company and probably his love. Just as Romeo has this unrequited love for Rosaline, so Mercutio can be seen to have an unrequited passion for Romeo. Those two relationships exist in counterpoint. An enormous amount of the language that Mercutio uses about Romeo is incredibly sexual. So here he imagines Romeo dreaming of Rosaline, but thinking of her as a Meddler Fruit. This is the Meddler Fruit, which is why he calls it an open arse. You can see from the shape of it, that's what it resembles. This is the slang of the time. It's what it would have been called. The Popperin pear was a pear that came from Belgium, from a place called Popperinge, and it was this sort of shape and therefore phallic. This is Elizabethan safe sex, but it's also Elizabethan male sex, just as it is in the modern day. So what we have is Mercutio's portrayal of Romeo so desperate to have sex with Rosaline that he's dreaming of her arse. But at the same time, this image enters Mercutio's head because he's saying, look, Romeo, you are the object of my desire, and if you could be satisfied with a female arse why not mine? Now, although this sexual imagery is not obvious to a modern audience, it would have been absolutely crystal clear, even blatant, to an audience at the time. They would have found it hilarious and would clearly see Mercutio's attraction to Romeo. But when Mercutio is with Romeo, he's much more subtle and circumspect. So here they have a battle of wits. "Thou hast more of the wild goose in one of thy wits," says Mercutio. Now, the wild goose was slang for a prostitute, but also the name of a particular kind of horse race where whoever was in the lead chose the direction. It was cross-country, and then everybody else followed. So on the surface, he's having this conversation about Romeo leading the battle of wits and Mercutio being unable to catch up. But on the other, he's praising Romeo for his prowess with women, or at least his sexual prowess, indulging his desires with prostitutes. That's where Mercutio is suggesting Romeo has been, rather than over Capulet's orchard wall chatting up Juliet. But look what he says next. "Romeo has more wits than I, Mercutio, have in my whole 5 wits. 5 wits here are the 5 senses. In other words, Romeo's sexual desire for women is at least 5 times stronger than Mercutio's. And this is his way of saying to Romeo, look, my passion is for you. You are the person I love. But he can't come out and say it. And we'll see how important this is when we later get to the duel with Tibolt. Now, in a normal tragedy, the tragic hero is a person of noble parentage who has a tragic flaw. But in this tragedy, Shakespeare makes sure that everyone who is killed is a noble character with a tragic flaw. And that tragic flaw is normally the same. It's hubris, pride, arrogance, challenging the gods. So here we can see what Mercutio's hubris is. He is desperate for conflict. His conversation with Benvolio just before the duel with Tibolt is designed to keep Benvolio there so that he can both persuade Romeo to fight Tibolt. Tibolt has issued a challenge and they're both desperate to see Romeo meet it and defeat Tibolt. Benvolio obviously is the peacemaker and he doesn't want this duel to happen in public because he knows that will lead to the prince executing the participants. Mercutio likes to bend reality to his own vision. He knows that Benvolio is a peacemaker, but instead he tries to persuade him through his wit and language that actually Benvolio would much rather prefer a fight. So he says, you'd quarrel with a man for crucking hazelnuts, just nuts, having no other reason than because you have hazel eyes. So taking offence because you're cracking a hazelnut. I've got hazel eyes. What have you got against me? Right, let's fight. So it's really humorous, very silly. Shakespeare uses this to show how all this feuding and this male bravado and fighting is deeply silly. But actually he's also pointing out this is a fundamental part of being male. This is why it's so dangerous to arm these men in society. They all carry swords and daggers. And because Mercutio is so keen to duel, he is the ultimate danger. He exists, of course, as a counterpart to Tibolt, who is also obsessed with dueling. We're encouraged by the play to dislike Tibolt and to empathise with Mercutio. And Shakespeare uses them both to say, look, both sides of male personality are actually dangerous and far too attracted to violence. When Tibolt arrives, he says to Mercutio, thou consortest with Romeo. And Mercutio takes this word, consort, and says, what, dost thou make us minstrels? Now the idea here is that Tibolt is accusing Mercutio and Romeo of being together, but a consort was also the lover of a king or prince. And so Tibolt is also suggesting that Mercutio and Romeo are in a homosexual relationship. Now, Mercutio doesn't come straight out and say, you're accusing us of being homosexual, because the word didn't exist. There was no word to label the love between two men, which is quite interesting when you think about it. It was quite common for younger men to have sexual relationships, and in society this was frowned on when those relationships extended into adulthood. So these young men were expected to grow up and marry and then have only heterosexual sex. So we can see Mercutio and Tibolt skirting around this apparent insult. And why it upsets Mercutio so much is that the accusation is unfounded. Mercutio would love to consort with Romeo. Romeo is clueless. So this will help explain why, when Romeo arrives, he is so desperate for Romeo to fight Tibolt, and also when Romeo doesn't fight Tibolt, why he is so desperate himself to fight Tibolt and humiliate him. Mercutio simply cannot understand why Romeo backs down from the duel. Well, obviously, because he doesn't know that Romeo is married to Juliet and therefore can't afford to kill a Capulet, a relative of hers. But he sees submission as vile. This is something that dogs do, that animals do, not that men do. It's as though Romeo has abandoned his masculinity. The passion with which Mercutio says this implies that he's almost falling out of love with Romeo in this very instant. In taunting Tibolt, we again see his great use of humour. There were some incredibly well-known fables which featured Reynard the fox and lots of other animals who he always outwitted, and one of the main ones was Tybert the cat. This is why Mercutio calls Tybert good king of cats. He's likening him to an animal in a children's story. But the other thing we really need to appreciate here is that he's not going to kill Tibolt. He's only going to take one of the 9 lives, and the rest he's going to dry beat him with. In other words, he's not going to draw any blood that's going to kill Tibolt. His wounds will be minor. Mercutio is completely confident that he can outfight Tibolt, and that Tibolt's dueling prowess is simply a pose. Now we'll see that his judgment is absolutely spot on. Romeo kills Tibolt easily. Benvolio fought Tibolt at the beginning, and Tibolt didn't hurt him in any way. There was no blood. However, this is hubris, the arrogance of thinking that just because he's more skilled than Tibolt, no harm can come from a duel where everybody's fighting with real weapons that kill. So again, Shakespeare is looking at this male society, particularly of young men, and pointing out how dangerous it is. He links that to patriarchy and male control through the main plot of Capulet exploiting Juliet. Male control of women's sexuality leads to her tragedy and Romeo's. And it's the male freedom of being able to duel, to revel in violence, which leads to the death of Mercutio and Tibolt. So everything that makes males powerful in society, Shakespeare uses to undermine them. Their own power is used against them. Even when Mercutio is facing death, he still resorts to humour. This makes us both sympathise with him and also realise how misplaced his hubris and confidence has been. This is the moment when he realises that he's going to die. Ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man. Grave meaning serious, but also grave meaning grave, and you'll actually have to find me a grave because I'll be dead. Here is someone who wants to be remembered for his last words, who's just as interested in death as he is in living. If he had been more interested in living, he would not have challenged Tibolt to a duel, and that's Shakespeare's point. When he kills off Mercutio, he kills off a wonderful character. In a way, he's saying, look, what a waste. And this kind of duelling had become fashionable in Shakespeare's day, and he's taking aim at it. He's saying, look, we've got society wrong, we must stop this. And in our 10th quotation, Mercutio's final words also act as a harbinger of fate. They bring the fate about. So he says, a plague of both your houses, they have made worms meat of me. And that is exactly what happens. Not just through the death of Romeo and Juliet, but actually a literal plague. Remember the friar's letter that Friar John was supposed to take to Romeo to tell Romeo about the plan to give this sleeping potion to Juliet and for Romeo then to come and wake her up, didn't get delivered. Why? Because Friar John was detained in a house where plague was suspected. No one could come out until a quarantine period had been served. So 2 days later, Friar John, spared by God, comes out, but the letter has not made it to Romeo, and this leads directly to the death of Romeo and Juliet through a plague. Now, we could argue that this plague is caused by God. It's part of fate's plan to end the feud through the death of the two lovers, as we remember from the prologue. Now, the other thing that Shakespeare is taking aim at in Mercutio here is his refusal to take responsibility for what he's done. Mercutio decided to fight Tibolt. Did not have to do that. Tibolt just asks, "What wouldst thou have with me?" He doesn't want to fight Mercutio at all. No, it was totally Mercutio's decision, and he gets killed because he made that decision. But who does he blame? He blames the feud between the Montagues and the Capulets. And this is his immaturity. Just as Romeo blames Juliet for making him effeminate and then decides to kill Tibolt. Who's actually to blame? Romeo. So Shakespeare uses these deaths to show how irresponsible men are and to point out how their ideals of what manhood and masculinity should be are wrong. He wants to change this version of masculinity in society and make society less patriarchal. I bet you never thought of it as a feminist play, did you? And if you'd like loads more top grade ideas, why not dip into my ultimate guide to Romeo and Juliet, available in the ink below? It's available in the ink below. Or check out the videos appearing here and here, which are free and equally awesome.